to Strength Series. We're now on episode 4 and we're going to be talking about mesocycles. With mesocycles we get to put all of the work of the microcycles and all the exercise classifications you learned about in episodes 1, 2 and 3 into a bigger picture training block. So what is a mesocycle? So it's basically a block of training with an overarching goal, be it add more muscle, get stronger, get faster in some sports, and a mesocycle is usually made up of microcycles, and a microcycle is usually a week. So typically for most people, a mesocycle is 3 to 6 weeks. It's synonymous with the word block. So if I use the word block, I also mean mesocycles. Repeated mesocycles or blocks are typically called phases. So let's say, for example, you go, I want to gain as much muscle as possible in a 3-month window. Well, you're not going to do a single block that's going to last 3 months because you probably want to change some of it and get some novel stimulus, make it more interesting. So you may do 3-4 week blocks in that phase, but they may all be hypertrophy mesocycles. So therefore it would be a hypertrophy phase. So an example of what that might look like is on the screen now. So I'm hoping you can see that. It's not too complex. It's quite straightforward. So why is there a need for mesocycles? So there's an old saying that the hunter that chases 2 deer doesn't eat. And in terms of technical reasons, when we dive a little bit deeper, doing all of the lifts and everything in one, so trying to get bigger, trying to get faster, trying to get stronger, is all well and good. And it works to a point. There becomes a point where you have to do more harder, challenging work at one of them attributes, well, all of them attributes, to make improvement. Now, the problem is when you do, if you try to drive all of them up, you run into recovery issues or achievability. You might not be able to do more work on all of them lifts. And that's the biggest reason for mesocycles. Is because we can direct work at one of them attributes, so just getting bigger, for example, and then just the outright raw strength we can maintain or not drive as aggressively. So not only that, each mesocycle can improve or likely improve the outcome of the next one. So the old saying, the wise man built his house upon the rocks. So you lay the foundation first, which will be the structural hypertrophy, where you get more muscular and build more mass, and that can potentially allow you to deal with more heavy loads in the strength training. And full circle, the strength training allows you to lift heavier in the hypertrophy phase, which allows you to cause more mechanical tension and stress on the muscle, to cause more muscle growth, to then get stronger in the strength phase. So hopefully that paints a little picture of why they're important. It's not just about they are an option, they become a necessity, especially in more advanced lifters. So just back on the topic, so some principles that many coaches ignore is, as a lifter improves, their minimum effective volume that they need to do may go up, so they have to do more challenging work at one attribute. And the very nature of doing more challenging work at one attribute invokes a higher recovery response. So the problem is they need to do more, but it's harder to recover from. So a lot of old school programming can't cater for that, and especially for drug-free lifters. So what happens is you do an old school volume block, and there's hardly any top singles or intensity work in there. It's all just volume-based stuff. 9 times out of 10, it's too much work to recover from. So you will either injure, shut down, and get like adaptive resistance, where your body just says, nah, I don't want to adapt to this. It's too much. Sort of like your hands getting too sore from deadlift. That is what's called a maladaptation. So we get maladaptation if we do too much work and not valid work. So then, but let's say someone manages the volume block, that's absolutely fine. They then go into an intensity block, and intensity blocks usually are like typically half the volume or even less of a volume block. I'm telling you now, the minimum effective volume and maximum recoverable volume for any given lifter is rarely twice the amount of work. So if we're going from a volume block to an intensity block and we're doing half the amount of work, there's a good chance we're not actually sat between minimum effective volume and maximum recoverable volume. And one of the training principles is we have to sit in this window, and it's a lot narrower than a lot of people may realize. Or for some people, it's extremely narrow. So not only that, when you do a volume block and not doing the intense stuff and lifting heavy, there's a good chance you're going to regress in strength, even though you're packing on muscle and conditioning. And then in the strength block, you're not doing enough volume, so all of the strength and conditioning, all of the hypertrophy, structural changes and conditioning is withering away while you potentially get stronger. And it just leads, a typical textbook is someone does that, goes to competition, peaks well, they do a really good competition, and then they feel like they have to start all the way back. And the numbers that they recently achieved seem totally unachievable. Even a month, 5 weeks down the line of the training, they're nowhere near what they did at competition. And they say, oh, it was an amazing peak. No, it wasn't an amazing peak. It was a poorly structured, large, top-down view of training, because you've crashed back to nothing. You're going to spend forever building back up to numbers that you could have been handling all year round safely. So there's no reason not to. So in this block periodization model, and I say block periodization loosely because it does use blocks, but it's very different to typical blocks. So the old concepts of the SFE, SD, SP, and GP that was used in the previous episodes stem largely from a Soviet coach and Olympian, a thrower called Anatoly Bondarchuk, and is regarded as one of the best sports scientific minds and coaches of all time, as well as being a gold medalist himself throwing. I think he hit like just shy of 88 meters on the hammer throw, which is like pretty outrageous. So the concept of them lifts is the sport form exercise will always be sport form, so it will always be heavy. The problem is if you do sets of 6, 7, or 8 on normal back squat in a volume phase, and that's your main squat slot, that's not actually squat. It is squat, but it's not our sport version of the squat. It's no different to a sprinter doing a volume phase where they go for a long distance jog or a walk. It just doesn't carry to sprinting, and that is the exact same. So high rep squats in a volume phase in place of a heavy squat slot is absolutely suboptimal and crazy. And if your coach is doing that, get a new coach. So the core concept is SDE is always SDE loading. Sport form exercise is always sport form loading, and SP is always SP loading targeted at muscularity. So how do we factor that into blocks? And the solution is how much we do of each of them. So sport form is always heavy, as we see. It's just that in a prep block, or what would be an old school volume block, I don't do volume blocks, I do prep blocks. A prep block would just do less of that work and more of the SP type stuff. If it was all about, a prep block would be about hypertrophy and preparation. The name says it all. Is we would do more of the SP movements and less of the SDE and much less of the sport form exercises, because it's very easy to maintain skills, providing they're being done. So doing sets of 8 with squat will not maintain maximal strength. Doing 1 rep lifting super heavy will retain max strength. So it's key that we jiggle the ratios around for where we're allocating work to make up the blocks. So on the topic of mesocycles then and blocks, here are some typical blocks that I use. This is 99% of my training structure. So a preparation meso is lots of sport specialized prep exercises, so lots of body building type variations, some SDE but very little competition lifts. But the competition lifts that I still do are still very heavy because maintenance, we have to do it, we're a powerlifter. Developmental mesocycle, so lots of developmental exercises, some sport form, so a little bit more than what we was doing in a prep block, but a lot less SP movements. Now, the final block, expression or peaking is what it's also called. Lots and lots and lots of competition lifts, some development exercises, and very little special preparatory exercises, so very little hypertrophy type movements. But the biggest takeaway point is sport form exercise is always heavy. Specialized development exercise is also always heavy, and a very close variation. It's just how much we do of them lifts. So a perfect example of a lifter who is competing in 16 weeks. I would break, depends on the lifter obviously, but a typical setup would be as this, and this is what would be middle of the road, which I'd recommend for most people to start with, would be a month prep cycle, which would be obviously more of the SP type stuff. 2 months, so 2 individual blocks of development mesocycles. Because there's 2 mesocycles over 8 weeks, that's an 8-week phase of development constituting 2 blocks. And then the final block would be the expression mesocycle, or the phase of expression. And that's where we're going to lift the most weight and get prepared for a competition, where we put it all into good use. So how do we distribute the lifts? Also, don't worry about, like, I'm aware I'm just talking quite quick, but don't worry about the numbers coming up. I'm literally going to give you the actual numbers, so you go, right, I can't be bothered thinking and working out. You don't need to. I'm going to present it all for you, don't worry. So this is how we typically do it. So get the challenging sets total per lift. So let's say, for example, you on a foundational week where you're balanced absolutely everything and you're a beginner lifter, as per my other episodes 1, 2, and 3, where we do a typical microcycle, there's 3 or 4 sets per movement. So let's just say it's 4 sets per movement to keep things simple. That's 4 SDE, 4 SFE, and 4 SP, so 12 slots per exercise. Because we bench twice as much to counter for squat and dead, so we do squat, bench, dead. We've got another bench setup. So I class touch and go bench as another competition exercise, just to keep things simple. So that would be 12 slots on, 12 sets on squat, 12 sets on bench, 12 sets on deadlift, and 12 sets on touch and go bench. Now, putting it all together for a beginner lifter, that's absolutely fine. You can just do 4 sets on everything. Always make loads of gains, but there comes a time when 4 sets isn't enough. We have to start doing more of one and taking away from the others, and that's exactly how we make the blocks. So my beginning recommendation is that you start with a small bias, and a perfect example of that, in a prep mesocycle, instead of doing 4 sport form exercises, sets, 4 development sets and 4 SPE sets, maybe make it 5, 4, 3. So the total is still the same, it's just a small bias. A large bias, which is more suited for advanced lifters that need even more directed work on one specific skill, will be something like, in a prep block, 7 SPE sets, 3 SDE sets, and only 2 sport form sets. Again, 12 in total. Now, one of the questions you've probably got is, what about GPE? I recommend just doing GPE 3 sets flat all the way throughout, same effort. And the reason is, for the most part, they're not interfering. So they're lats, abs, you recover quite quick from them. They don't have much impact in terms of interference for the other lifts. And the amount that you'd get from them from like concentrated loading, it just doesn't make much sense. So there isn't a GPE sort of phase. They could be, but you don't really need one, because powerlifting is quite a simple sport, and if it's just about force production, which is a large product of skill and how much tissue there is to apply that skill. If it was something like a sport where there was more plyometrics, agility, turning, running, jumping, wrestling, it'd largely be drastically different, and the amount of work, there'd be more classifications, and where we'd bias the work would even be more drastic. But anyway, for the takeaway point is, GPE, just keep at 3 sets or 4 sets all the way throughout the program. 3 sets just tends to be a sweet spot. 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps, or maybe even more, but that tends to be the middle of the road. So once you've done that and you know your ratios, you then just plug in the exercises, and the exercise that you should be using the ones from the tutorial of episode 2. So onto the good stuff. You actually want to see physical numbers. So a good starting point for your first large top-down cycle, but in terms of sets per week, per lift, would be, so say for example on squat, In a preparation phase, you would only do 3 sport form sets, 4 SD sets, and 5 SPE sets. And same with squat, and same with dead. Also with bench, remember we use 2 bench variations, so one's touch and go, and we class that as sport form as well. And that just helps keep everything simple, so 2 upper and 2 lower. If not, if you just want to keep, maybe you do bench like at half the frequency of lower body, which is absolutely fine. If you've got a squat day, a bench day, and a dead day, then you just stick to these numbers on here. You wouldn't have to double up on bench. So now we know the sets, the actual loading, we can use the loading parameters from the early episodes to actually make the loading parameters. So there we go. So example. So let's say sport form slot on bench. In an expression phase, you do a 1 at RP8, which is around an opener, a 1 at RP9, which is like close to your seconds or around your second attempts. Drop 15% and then do 3 sets of 3 with the weight that you've dropped from. So, but then in contrast, let's say you're doing close grip bench for your SP slot, you only do a set at 7.5, 8 reps at 7.5, and then another set at RP8, that's it. But in a prep block, them 2 same exercises, competition lift is only 1 at 8, which is still around an opener, still heavy as we discussed, but then only 2 sets of 3 dropping 10% after the 1 at RP8, which is not much work at all. But then you look at the SP slot and there's a set at 7, a set at RP 7.5, and then 3 sets of 8 at 8. So that's a lot of work that's going to drive the adaptation in the prep block of hypertrophy, but less towards strength, unlike the expressive block. So I'm hoping that sort of clicks. The biggest takeaway is we just bias where we want. We just change the size of the slice of the pizza of where we want to do the work to cause what change that we're after. And we can sequence them in logical blocks. So in this case, prep, development, and expression, to make the best outcome come the end of the cycle, in our case a competition, or to make each block more effective because of the block before it, which is also called phase potentiation. So, go back one, I'm sorry, there we go. So in summary, the blocks allow for more concentrated efforts of adaptation from one classification, allows for a top-down approach, because we've episodes 1, 2, and 3 worked on building a program from bottom up to make a training week. This is now going to allow you to build the training months in hope of setting PBs or going to a competition on a very specific date. What's next? I wanted to cover it in this, but I was just aware that the episodes seem to be inadvertently getting longer and longer and longer, which is not my intention. So I'm sorry if I'm boring you to death, but this stuff's important, and it's potentially going to save you hundreds from hiring a coach, when you can become a coach better than any other coach because you know yourself and your own logs and your own performance, and you've got these videos. So episode 5 is going to cover fatigue management, deloads and preloads. So they're important because you can't just do all of them parameters that I've just explained there, sadly, indefinitely without some sort of break or recovery or something like that. So we're going to cover preloads and deloads, which can also help bridge the gap between one program and another, or a new block and another. Pivot weeks, which are a whole different beast altogether for reducing fatigue, spurring on new gains and recovering from the work that you've just done, and more. But if there's anything else you'd like to see, as always, just drop us a message on the chat. And yeah, thanks for listening.